Start at 12:01. All right, guys. So welcome to Waterton Glacier Science and History Week 2020. Thanks so much for joining us as we dive into the science and history that characterizes Waterton Glacier International Peace Park. Before we begin the presentation, I would like to acknowledge that these are the traditional lands of the Casias, the Kootenai, the Salish, and the Quilespie people. We offer this acknowledgement to recognize Indigenous peoples' enduring connection to their traditional territories, to observe the history of the land that is currently shared by many peoples, and to recognize stewardship as a shared responsibility of all those who reside in a territory. So this is the final day of a 4-day webinar series, and we have been having so much fun all week long connecting with scientists and historians from Waterton Glacier International Peace Park. So for those of you who don't know, Waterton Glacier International Peace Park is comprised of Waterton Lakes National Park in Alberta, Canada, and Glacier National Park in Montana, USA. And this partnership is the first of its kind in the world. And so it was intended to promote goodwill between nations and to underscore the fact that wilderness transcends political boundaries. So this event is really a testament to the success of that partnership, and it allows us to tell the story that is Waterton Glacier International Peace Park. So today, as I said a little bit earlier, we are so lucky to be featuring Kelli Cassias, and she is going to be discussing the Poacher and the Bootlegger, revisiting the Doody Homestead. So just a little bit about Kelli before we begin, and you can see her over to my left or my right. Kelli is employed as a historical archaeologist at Western Cultural, a small cultural resources management firm based in Missoula. And she is currently an anthropology PhD candidate at the University of Montana. Kelli's dissertation focuses on infrastructural growth, expansion of gender roles, and the economic stability afforded to foreign nations, states, and Montana mining communities through the activities of moonshining, bootlegging, and the smuggling of illicit alcohol during the Prohibition era. Her research utilizes theories from sociology and economics, as well as historical, landscape, social, and behavioral archaeology to contextualize and identify the archeological markers of sustained social resistance. Kelli's research interests include historical investigations of disenfranchised populations, social movements, and rapid sociocultural change as expressed in the physical alteration of the landscape. So thank you again for joining us. The presentation is going to last about 30 minutes, and we'll have 10 minutes for questions at the end. So if you have a question, go ahead and type it in the questions box on your desktop. And then a final reminder, if you need live captioning, we're going to go ahead and paste that in the chat box as well. So look for that. And with that, everybody join me in giving Kelli Cassias a virtual round of applause, and we will let her take it away.
All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. So I am going to be talking about the Doody Homestead, and it's home of Josephine Duty, aka the bootleg lady of Glacier National Park. And I first came across the story of Josephine by way of the John Fraley book, Wild River Pioneers. And it was during my master's research of women moonshiners during the Prohibition era. But in 2018, as part of a dissertation research on a related topic, a small team of archaeologists from the U of M, including myself, went to the homestead in order to undertake a 2-day survey of the homestead and ground truth some of the statements made in the Fraley book, specifically related to Josephine's moonshining activity. And as with most surveys, we left with more questions than answers. But today I'm going to present what we found as told through the story published by Mr. Fraley. So hopefully this will work, and we can just get started on this. So let's see. What? All right. So Ginger, can you see this? All right, well, I'm just going to assume that we are.
Yes, I can.
Okay, all right. Okay. All right, so this is pictured here is the Doody Homestead. as it appeared after 1921. But our story really begins with, let me get my cursor here, with this man. His name is Dan Duty, and he's a Colorado man, and who, like many others, moved to northwestern Montana to try his luck at gold prospecting. And similar to about 95% of those seeking their fortunes, he found only hardship and a series of failed mining claims. So Dan turned to poaching and fur trapping, along with taking an odd job every now and then to sustain himself. And on his many travels, tracking game through what would become Glacier National Park, he came across the ideal place to build a life. The land fronted about 4 million acres of untamed wilderness, was fed year-round by the glacial waters of Harrison Creek, and it was home to an abundance of elk, deer, bear, and mountain lion, among other game. And in 1890, Dan stakes his claim on about 160 acres in the Nyack Flats area. And after finding gainful employment laying track for the Great Northern Railroad through Marias Pass, he constructed this small cabin and set out to build his dream outfitters lodge. Now, the short-lived railroad boomtown of McCarthy'sville, it's somewhere around in this area where the yellow square is. McCarthy'sville was a rough and tumble town, and it was the base of operations and home for approximately 1,000 residents, most of who were employed laying rail. Now, the town lay 26 miles southeast of Dan's home. And due to his employment, he often found himself frequenting one of the town's 32 saloons and one of the numerous brothels. And it was one of these establishments that Dan first met Josephine Gaines. Now, Josephine was born into a well-to-do Macon County, Georgia family in 1854, and she was given the benefit of a good education. She was bright and a wiry young woman, and she had a very wicked tongue and a very volatile temper. And Josephine moved to the West with her fiance sometime in the 1870s. And upon their arrival in Colorado, Josephine's fiance promptly left her, and she fell into a life of prostitution in the dance halls and brothels of Colorado mining communities. And in the town of Pueblo, her life takes a very dark turn when she shoots and kills a man. And before she was to stand trial on murder charges, Josephine fled the state, and she landed in McCarthy'sville in 1890. Now in her 30s, and marked with a fugitive status, Josephine began to nurse an addiction to opium, and she supplied her habit through what Josephine characterized as dancing. But Josephine was different from the other women who found themselves in a similar situation. Her straightforward attitude, quick temper, and sharp tongue really commanded respect from the men. And her flagrant use of the colorful language and open heart also ingratiated her to all the hardened railroad men of the town, including Dan, who happened to be on the lookout for a wife. And as far as he was concerned, Josephine fit the bill. So one night in 1892, while Josephine was in an altered state, Dan kidnaps her, ties her to a mule, and he sets out on a several-day journey to the homestead. Once there, he locks her in a small one-room cabin and nurses her through many weeks of rage-filled drug withdrawals. When Josephine emerges clean and sober, despite her threats and anger towards Dan of the prior weeks, she didn't run. She stays and allegedly marries Dan in frontier wedding the same year. And together, they begin to fulfill Dan's vision of turning the home into a lodge. Once the laying of track had been completed, Dan became a full-time outfitter and backcountry guide to the railroad men and tourists that were starting to stream into the area. Josephine opened her small home to a stream of paying visitors, taking care of their daily boarding, nutritional, and alcohol needs. And when they weren't hosting a array of guests, the couple hunted mountain lions with their Airedale dogs, fished the Flathead River, worked the land, and eked out a modest but pretty decent life. And Dan's hunting business flourished, despite hosting hunting parties well out of season. And he also allegedly engaged his unknowing guest in canned hunts. And the story goes that Dan lured game, specifically bear, into traps close to the homestead by hanging carcasses from the trees. Now, once snared and immobile, Dan would then bring his guests to quote unquote track the bear. And once the men found the animal, it would rear up as it normally would to defend itself. And Dan would order the hunter to shoot. The animal, now mortally wounded, would be left to bleed out while Dan and the guest returned to the lodge for a bite to eat. So apparently this was life in the 1800s. But during a survey in 2018, we happened upon this natural spring that's shown on the left. And it was modified with an embedded 1-inch pipe shown on the right. This natural spring led to a man-made channel that ended with this small wallow about 100 yards east of the lodge. And surrounding the wallow were fresh tracks of several animals. And knowing the canned hunting story, a theory was posited. Was this another lure for Dan's hunts? And as this map shows, this next map shows you exactly how close that wallow is to the lodge. So it does really fit in line with the narrative. But it can just as easily be a rational modification for diverting a water resource closer to the home just for general purposes. Due to our survey being limited to visual inspection alone, we weren't able to ascertain whether the pipe was lead or galvanized steel, which could give us a tentative timeline of when the pipes were at least manufactured. And there were no other cultural materials observed around the piping or the wallow to hint at the exact purpose for those modifications. But in a homestead that is thus devoid of any type of piping within the home or other outbuildings, piping really does remain an unexplained oddity. And with a bit of remote sensing, such as GPR or metal detecting, we could at least establish the extent of these types of modifications and start to answer why it was there in the first place. But getting back to our story, we left off at Dan's guide business. So one customer that often partook in Dan's services was James Hill, founder of the Great Northern Railroad. On a fall excursion, James was seriously injured, and Dan had to toboggan him out of the back country, ferry him across the Middle Fork River and onto the safety of an awaiting train. So in gratitude, Hill ordered trainmen to stop anytime the Duties needed a ride or basically anything else. And he constructed a GNR siding, aptly named the Duty siding, specifically for that purpose. And it's not that the railroad engineers actually needed to be prompted to stop. They did this all on their own. The Duties had retained their strong ties to the railroad community, and engineers often just parked the train and hiked to the homestead for long visits and a bit of Josephine's high-quality moonshine. The Duties and the railroad men also used the siding to increase the distribution of Josephine's home brew. The story goes that the engineers would sound the train whistle to announce their arrival at the siding. Josephine would then emerge from the forest and delivered a pre-requested amount of booze to the waiting men by rowing across the river to the siding. Now, according to this 1914 plat map that you're looking at, the only siding to exist near the homestead was that of Rock Hill, and it's circled in red on the left. The first appearance of this siding is unknown, as there were no prior plat surveys conducted in the area before 1914. What we do know is that it no longer exists. The placement of the siding does give a bit of credence to the Hill story. The simple reason being that the railroad station Belton, established in the 1890s, which would grow to become the town of West Glacier, was only a few miles further north. So a siding here is redundant. In addition, the road that's marked on the lower part of the screen in orange, it's marked as a trail, and it lies between Belton and the Marias Pass and was continuously being developed during the 1920s and the 1930s in order to increase auto tourism into the area. And it follows the same path as modern-day Highway 2. So if there were an additional sighting named after the Dutys, road construction would have had to go on around it, and there just simply is no indication of that. So Rock Hill and the famed Duty sighting are most likely one and the same. And this makes sense, knowing the points of access into the home. The two trails that were actually marked on this map, and they're highlighted in the bright yellow, are the two trails that lead to the Doody Homestead. The shortest one being the one on the far right is a direct path south from the homestead to the river, and it jumps out a half mile below the sighting. The far western route, following the south boundary trail that eventually turns southwest and leads directly across the river from Rock Hill sighting. And this is a hike that takes about 25 to 30 minutes on a good day. Not shown on the original map, but shown here in blue, is an additional trail that our team accessed, originating from the same landform of the western path, but it cuts the journey to the homestead by about 10 to 15 minutes. While our team was settling on a site for our base camp, it was really no coincidence that this is where we actually camped, not because of its access to the homestead. The lower trail would have been much faster, but we settled there due to the fact that it's a less difficult river crossing. And for Josephine, who is now in her 60s, rowing across the river, both upstream and downstream from this point would have been relatively short and easily accomplished outside of high water levels during the spring runoff. But in 1910, the land backing the homestead was incorporated into the national park system as Glacier National Park. And due to his extensive knowledge of the local backcountry and expertise in hunting and trapping, Dan, along with other mountain men, were given the position of park ranger the same year. His duties included predator control, trail maintenance, general patrol, and enforcement of park regulations. And despite his new standing as a protector of the park, for the next 6 years, Dan continued to host year-round hunting parties, poaching the local wildlife with little consequence until his firing in 1916, which was presumably for poaching. And for the most part, life as usual continued on for the couple. Dan hunted, Josephine fished, and they hosted a steady stream of paying hunters and treated park rangers, railroad men, and friends that happened by to a slice of pie or a slug of whiskey, right? So by 1919, Dan's health begins to deteriorate. So the couple hires several men to help maintain the homestead and take over running booze across the river. And 2 years later, in 1921, Dan succumbs to a heart attack, leaving the homestead in Josephine's care. Well into her late 60s and unable to really lead multiple hunting parties or to maintain the property on her own, she continues to employ men in expanding their roles to include the continuation of the hunting and fishing guide services, at least for a bit. In 1921, the homestead had grown to contain 5 main features. And we're starting with the picture in the lower left and moving clockwise. This picture in the lower left is what's left of the root cellar. Above that is a smokehouse. It's also rumored to have contained a 50-gallon moonshine still. A lodge home with the recent addition of a second story, a guest cabin connected to the lodge by a breezeway. And this picture is actually a large depression thought to be the footprint of that guest house, as it no longer exists. And of course, the obligatory 2-seater outhouse. Now, it's also rumored that at this point, Josephine increased her alcohol production when quality moonshine came with a black market price tag due to Prohibition. And it's connected to a 2018 discovery. And notice the barren spot northwest of the home, outlined by the yellow rectangle. And it turns out this is an undocumented agricultural field, as evidenced by the high volume of invasive plant species seen in the photograph and its rectangular shape when you're actually on the ground looking at it. And it was tilled by the oddest and most well-known artifact found on the property, and it's this Fordson tractor. The tractor dates to between 1926, the last production date shown on the dash, and 1928, when U.S. production of the tractor ceased. So the tractor was utilized during Josephine's residency. Now, whether the purchase reflected her advancing age or increased grain production is uncertain, but she definitely had the ability and resources to produce more grain for distillation purposes if she so chose. However, there's only anecdotal evidence to suggest that Josephine produced more alcohol during Prohibition than she did pre-Prohibition. No one really bothered to keep a running tally because, by all accounts, every ounce of liquor she sold, both before and after 1921, was illegal. She paid no taxes and she had no license to produce. But there is a quirk with early model tractors that could account for an increase in alcohol production if indeed it happened. The diesel engines and tractors that we know today were only coming onto the market in the 1930s. Early model tractors such as this were engineered to run off multiple forms of fuel. The Fortson tractor had a 21-gallon fuel tank, and it could be run with gasoline, kerosene, or alcohol. So Josephine obviously already had all the equipment and access to the necessary ingredients to produce alcohol, and it wouldn't have cost her a dime to produce excess alcohol for fuel. But there is no doubt that Josephine sold illicit liquor, but whether she was manufacturing more for consumption during Prohibition is highly debatable. Fraley states in his book that the hunting portion of her business was scaled back after Dan's death and eventually eliminated due to increasing park patrols, suggesting a drop in business, although the fishing excursions remained. And this would seemingly have put a large crimp in her pocketbook. So how could she afford to add a second story onto the home, continue to employ hired hands, not to mention purchase the tractor if she hadn't ramped up production? And to answer this takes a bit of speculation that will lead us back to the field and forward into a 1928 federal raid that took place. And to the question, between the combined capacity of her stills and the potential grain yield from her field, how much alcohol could Josephine manufacture with what she had readily available? Now, let me preface the following calculations by saying this. This is potential manufacturing capacity, and it doesn't necessarily reflect what Josephine produced on a yearly basis, as more work really does need to be done before any solid conclusions about her distilling habits can be made. So in 1928, federal forces in cooperation with the hesitant but compliant park staff raided the homestead, and they set about destroying 3 stills, including a 50-gallon, a 20-gallon, and a 25-gallon still, as well as destroying 12 barrels of mash and 18 gallons of moonshine. But as of 2018, this is the only remaining still on the property, and it has about a capacity of 25 gallons. We found this northeast of the lodge in what is most likely a refuse dumping area, and it's complete with the hatchet marks, as you can see. We didn't find the cap or the copper coil, commonly referred to as a worm, so its identification as a still is tentative. Taken as it is, this resembles the kettles today that are used to combine the grain, waters, and sometimes additional sugar to make the mash that will eventually be left to ferment prior to distillation. But aside from that, her stills reportedly had a combined capacity of 95 gallons. And the general rule of thumb is that a still will produce a final batch that is about 20% of the size of the still. So in this case, 20% of 95 gallons would be about 19 gallons of moonshine. The yield can be increased with the addition of sugar. In this case, if Josephine wanted to squeeze another 10 to 15 gallons, she would have had to have added, at a minimum, about 54 pounds of sugar. But this would not this wouldn't have produced the high quality grain whiskey that she was known for. So now we come to the question is how much grain could the field yield if crops were dedicated to in whole to alcohol production? So I'm not going to bore you with the math, but the field is about 1/8 of an acre. And depending on the type of grain that was planted, she could reap anywhere from 450 to 950 pounds of grain. And that's with both the spring and a winter planting. So to put this into perspective of alcohol manufacture, and according to modern recipes, 2 pounds of grain are required for every gallon of whole grain mash produced. The feds destroyed 12 barrels of mash, and assuming that these are the standard 53-gallon sizes and filled to at least the 50-gallon mark, they would have required 1,200 pounds of grain. So in short, 12 50-gallon barrels of mash represents more than a year's worth of crops, and in final distillation could yield about 120 gallons of alcohol just using that 20% rule. But the timing of the raid also clues us in on how Josephine was distilling. The raid took place in the month of February. And this has an average temperature of about 38 degrees. And yeast, a necessary ingredient for fermentation, becomes inactive at 40 degrees. So to promote proper fermentation, the mash barrels would need to have been housed at a consistent 58 to 75 degrees for 7 to 21 days before distillation. And the narrative doesn't indicate where these barrels were discovered. And indoor heated storage options during the winter were limited to the house and possibly the guest house. And complicating the issue is that a full 50-gallon barrel weighs somewhere around 500 pounds. So it's not really easily movable during winter snows. It all suggests that the bulk of mash was most likely being stored in colder temperatures for later distillation when the weather warmed, rather than for immediate manufacture. And this kind of hints to a large fall harvest. But because Prohibition outlawed alcohol, the price to secure a pint, quart, or even a gallon quadrupled in some areas of Montana, including the Northwest region. The going price of a gallon of shine in 1928 was $15 to $25 a gallon, and even more profitable if sold in pints and quarts. At the lowest production amount of 120 gallons and sold at the lowest price of $15 a gallon, that's about $1,800 or the equivalent of over $27,000 in 2020 for a single run. Now, the grains were recycled for another run, which was the norm, but it does require the addition of sugar, which, as stated before, would not produce the booze Josephine was known for. It could bring a potential profit of over $54,000. Sold at the highest price of $25 a gallon, the profit increased to the equivalent of over $45,000, doubling to $91,000 on a second run. So she had the potential to make enormous profits, at least with the product that she had on hand in 1928. Whether this amount of distillation was the rule rather than the exception, it is unknown. However, it has to be said that had Josephine stuck with just 2 runs of 19 gallons each, she would have profited half of the average yearly salary of the U.S. worker at the time. And her field would have produced enough grain to sustain both her dietary needs as well as alcohol production. Full excavation of the 2 trash pits located on the property and a soil analysis of the field could shed some light on the ingredients she used and actually hint at the quantity of alcohol she normally produced and whether or not she was purchasing supplemental grains or adding sugar to her alcohol. But another odd piece of physical evidence that has an outside chance of identifying the ingredients Josephine used comes from the 2018 discovery of culturally modified trees. These trees mark the south boundary trail leading to the homestead. And this is a common occurrence on many trails in the backcountry. And really, we didn't think much of them. That is until we reached the homestead, specifically the area where the root cellar and smokehouse are located and encountered these 4 scarred trees in very close proximity to each other, which was a bit of a curiosity, especially given their size. And these types of modifications outside their uses as trail markers are usually attributed to Native American use and indicative of extraction of the cambium layer. And it's a nutrient-rich layer just beneath the outer bark of a tree. And there are many scarred pine trees that have been recorded throughout the park. However, these marked trees in the homestead are large, which were utilized by Native Americans, although not as heavily. The cambium layer of the western larch in particular produces a sweet tasting gum that when dried and ground was used in flour as a leavening agent. The layer was also valued for its medicinal qualities. The gum was used as a dressing for cuts or chewed to relieve headaches and sore throats. And when it's infused into teas, it relieves coughs and congestion. So along with Native Americans, there is a high probability that the Dutys also had a working knowledge of the practice and emulated it for the exact same reasons. And on a later inspection, just north of the homestead, a little ways off the path, was a stand of approximately 20 larch, of which about 80% were similarly marked, which brings up additional questions. So in addition to the nutritional and medicinal value of the cambium, it's also very sugar rich, which led to the theory of Josephine using the cambium layer to increase her alcohol yield. Whether this is actually possible or not is really a question for experimental archaeology, and one that we didn't broach, at least not yet. I'm still interested in trying to figure this one out.
Kelly,
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. I'd just like to let you know that you have about 3 to 4 more minutes.
All right, we're good. All right. So the Duty story ends with Josephine leaving the homestead of her own volition in 1931. And she takes with her just one still. And she dies of pneumonia at the age of 82 in a Kalispell hospital, and she's buried in an unmarked grave. And I believe she does have a headstone now, and I believe that it was John Fraley that purchased it for her. The 160-acre homestead passed through several hands between 1936 and 2012, before the remaining 120 acres were purchased and incorporated into Glacier National Park. And in that time, the Doody home has partially collapsed. It's a victim of the elements, and a few more heavy snows in the outhouse and the smokehouse are not far off from that same fate. But what we found in our survey is that the homestead is much more than just a setting for a story about a poacher and a bootlegger. It is a 160-acre time capsule that holds the material remains of 40 years of Montana history. It speaks to such grand themes as mountain homesteading, railroad development, park development, gender roles, social resistance, and indigenous uses of the land, just to name a few. More important than that, the site stands as a testament to how history was lived rather than how it was made. And this is an important distinction and a perspective of historical archaeology that should be explored to its fullest extent before the homestead deteriorates any further. And that is basically the story of the Dutys. So I think we go now to more questions, don't we? To questions?
Yeah, that was great. Those pictures were amazing. Thank you so much for sharing those with us, Kelly. So we do have a few questions, and the first is from Jeremy. It says, are there any future readings on Josephine Duty or other women bootleggers that you can recommend, either by you or others? And could you, please expand on that?
When it comes to women moonshiners, you're just lucky to get little excerpts of them in moonshining books. The John Fraley book, Wild River Pioneers, he dedicates a whole chapter to Josephine Duty. And I know that I've seen a couple of articles on a woman named Bertie Brown. But yeah, there are no books dedicated to women moonshiners that I know of. At least not in the Montana area, which is where my focus is.
Great. And then Jeremiah has a follow-up question, or I'm sorry, Jeremy has a follow-up question. It says, was Josephine's murder followed or was it forgotten after she left?
Now, John Fraley says that the feds came a couple times to arrest her, and that she was hidden away within that small cabin, that she overcame her addiction, that's where she would hide when they came. She was given plenty of warning because of the railroad men, the park rangers. She had very close connections with these people, and so she was always warned when the feds were in the area, and she would hide away in that cabin. And I believe it's something like a mile away from the homestead. But she was never caught for it. I can tell you that. So even after her even after the raid, the 1928 raid, they, for whatever reason, they didn't come after her for that murder.
Okay. Thank you. We have another question here from Kim. It says, is the date of collapse of the main house known?
As far as we know, it was 2015. That's what we were told by the park rangers. So it was pretty.
It was what?
It was pretty recent. So, and it was due to the heavy snows that year.
Stephen has a question, and it is this homestead accessible via hiking?
Yes, it is. That's how most people come across it. So if you just ford the middle fork of the Flathead River and you get onto that landform, you will see those two trails leading directly to that homestead. So it's not hard to find at all. It's very well known.
It's a beautiful hike too.
It is.
Yeah, it is very beautiful, especially this time of year. So we have another question from Candy, and it says, was the first cabin where it is today, that she put it on the second story?
Okay, so was that the original cabin? The answer is I'm not really sure, to tell you the truth.
Okay.
You know, the fact that she added a second story onto it tells me that it is the original cabin. But you know, the picture that showed the very first cabin that Dan created is unlike this one. So, I mean, the guest cabin may have been the original first cabin.
Very cool.
So the answer is we don't know. We've got to do a little bit more work out there to find that out.
Great. I have another question here from Paul. He says, could LiDAR illuminate the area of the spring, the pipe, the wallow, or associated areas?
I believe that it can, and that is my preference to do a little bit of LiDAR out there. But right now there hasn't been any of that done, and it's pretty expensive to undertake. So the GPR, magnetometer, metal detector could do the same kind of thing and illuminate those areas. Just at a cheaper, it would be cheaper, but it'd be time intensive for sure. But LiDAR could do that, yes.
Cool. Another question here from Candy. What kind of grain was grown for the moonshine?
That is something that we don't know, and we would need the soil analysis for. So in my calculations, I accounted for rye, barley, and corn. But it was a special grain mixture, is how Fraley put it. So I'm going with either rye or barley.
Okay. Another question here from Oliver. It said, would Josephine Duty have been part of the hunting expeditions?
She would have. She was a very good hunter. And actually, when she would, her and her husband would go out to hunt mountain lions. And on one of these excursions, she was injured by a mountain lion. So yes, she would go hunting.
Oh my gosh.
She's a very tough woman.
She sounds like it. Very much so. I have another question here from Jean. It says, can you talk a bit more about the importance of leaving artifacts and cultural items in place? With the homestead an easy hike, is there any concerns about items being removed?
There has been, but you know, when we were up there, I was surprised that there really is not a lot of vandalism going on. People are pretty much respecting this property. But of course, we wouldn't know if they had removed anything. It's not under any listing. It's not under the National Register of Historic Places. It has no extra protection other than being within the park. So at this point, you know, I think the park just kind of hopes that people just respects the area. But it is important that none of these artifacts are removed, because it takes information from us that we could kind of put together how they were living their lives. But really, it is up to the park, you know, to maintain patrols on this area. And there are park rangers that go through every once in a while. When we were there for 2 days, we saw at least 3 rangers. So they are patrolling the area pretty heavily.
That's great. Yes, it is super important to protect our cultural resources.
It is.
For sure. So, great question, Jean. It looks like we have another here from Oliver. Would the rail workers stopping at the homestead have known her from McCarthy'sville?
Most likely. Most likely. Yeah, she was a person that let her presence be known. And like I said, she got along more with men than she did women. She could really relate to men. So yeah, it's my idea that, yeah, they knew her from McCarthy'sville.
That's great. All right, well, let's see. Oh, it looks like we have one final question, and we're hoping, people are hoping to get other pictures of Josephine Duty.
Oh, you know, there's only 2, and those are the 2 that I showed. Those are the only ones that I've been able to find of her.
Wow.
I wish there were more when she was younger. I would have liked to have seen her then.
Yeah, definitely. All right, well, guys, thanks again for joining us today. If we didn't get to your question, we are going to try and forward those to Kelly, and we'll try and answer those after the fact. We will be sending a survey at the conclusion of this webinar, and that really helps us plan future events. So please fill that out and give us your feedback. And thanks again to Kelli Cassias for joining us. It was a really wonderful talk. And thanks to David. Yeah, thank you to David Restivo as well for all things technical. It's been great. And have a great day, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.